Romans chapter 12, verse 8. He who exhorts in exhortation, he who gives with liberality, he who leads with diligence, he who shows mercy with cheerfulness. This passage speaks about the gifts of grace. There are 7 gifts of grace apart from 9 spiritual gifts. Those 7 gifts of grace are already we have touched that list. But I want to meditate upon the gift of spiritual leadership. One who leads leadership, spiritual leadership. It's a gift, it's an attitude, it's a mindset, it's a skill. It's not a possession, it's not simply just an authority, but it is a skill, it is an attitude, it is a gift, spiritual leadership. Luke chapter 6 verse 39 says, a blind cannot guide somebody. If a blind guides somebody, it will be a dangerous thing. Both will fall into pits. So first, leadership needs a clear-cut sight, outlook. So Bible says that Satan has blinded the spiritual eyes of unsaved people. For spiritual leadership, born-again experience is mandatory. If you are not born again, you cannot get this spiritual leadership spirit or spiritual leadership gift. Your eyes need to be open. Paul prays for Ephesians. I pray that your spiritual eyes may be enlightened. So not only to be opened, also to be enlightened. You must have a clear-cut outlook, a clear-cut insight about what, sight about, outlook about whom. The following verses of Luke chapter 6 verses 41 and 42. Don't see the dust in others' eyes. When you have a timber, a wood, piece of wood inside your eyes, first see your lackingness, see your shortcomings, see your imperfections, and do something to rectify them, to correct them. Then go and see the lackingness, the shortcomings, the imperfections of others, the dust in others' eye. That is secondary. But the timber, the wooden piece in your own eyes are primary. So a correct outlook upon himself, then a correct outlook upon others. That's the real quality of the spiritual leaders. Nobody is perfect. If only the perfect should become spiritual leader, nobody is there except Jesus. You may have lackingness, you may have shortcomings, you may have imperfections, but you have to find out, you have to realize, and you have to correct it. You have to rectify it. Then you have to go for correcting, leading people into perfection. That is what spiritual leadership. A right outlook upon self and right insight upon people. Secondly, Matthew chapter 20 verses 26 and 27. Jesus said, if you want to become greater, if you want to become the chief, you must act like a servant. You must act like a slave. You must serve. You must work. There is a myth in India regarding leadership. In India, leadership means many think like this. Leadership is connected with politics. They only think of political leaders. They will show themselves to be something, particularly in Tamil Nadu. Political leaders, they will show themselves to be something. They will be show people. And secondly, what people think in India on leaders. Leaders have followers of thousands and lakhs and millions. But that's not the fact. That's the myth. Bible speaks about leaders over 10 people. Even Exodus chapter 18 verse 25 speaks on leaders over 10 people, leaders over 100 people, leaders over 1,000 people. Moses was the leader of the nations, leader over all the Israelites. Under him, he appointed leaders in various levels. Leaders of 10 people, leaders of 50 people, leaders of 100 people, leaders of 1,000 people, like that, and so on. So leaders and leadership means no need to have a multitude following you. You can guide and lead and influence even 3 people. In First Chronicles chapter 11 verse 21, it says, there were 3 warriors. One was a leader. There is a team of 3 warriors. One was a team leader. Even you can be a leader for 3 people, including you. You can guide and lead and influence and direct 2 people. That's also leadership. Leadership not necessarily must have thousands and millions of people. Not necessarily. So, if you want to become a leader, a spiritual leader, if you want to become the leader, spiritual leader, if you want to receive the spiritual leadership gift, you need to put on the attitude of a servant, attitude of an usher, attitude of a volunteer, not commander. Another myth about leaders, they always command. They don't work, they will command. But not like that. Jesus showed a model. He washed the feet of the disciples. So spiritual leadership means serving, working, assuring, volunteering, a servant leadership, servanthood leadership, a servant model leadership. And Mark 10 verses 42 to 44 speaks about the secular leadership. We should not be like secular leaders. Many secular leaders are arrogant. They are proud. They are arrogant. The spiritual leader should be humble. The very first alphabet in spiritual leadership is humility. If somebody is not humble, he is not at all a spiritual leader. If somebody is arrogant, he cannot be a spiritual leader. And exercising authority rudely. That's what Jesus mentioned in Mark 10 verses 42 to 44. We should not exercise authority rudely. A spiritual leader should not be arrogant or proud. He needs to be humble. He needs to be the last person in the team. So think that you are the last and least person. That kind of humility you must put on. And 1 Timothy chapter 3 verse 1 speaks about leadership of ministry. So far I have shared on the leadership among believers, how believers can be spiritual leaders. We need a spiritual leader to guide the Sunday school teachers. We need a spiritual leader to guide a prayer cell, a house prayer group. Of course, we need a leader to guide the choir. We need a leader to guide the musicians, technicians. We need leaders over 2 people, 3 people, 10 people in the ministry. But in 1 Timothy chapter 3 verse 1, we find leadership over ministers. All the 5 kind of ministers are leaders, undoubtedly. They have the gift of leadership already. But some ministers are leaders over leaders. Apostles were there. Also chief apostles also were there. Prophets were there. Samuel was leading the prophets in 1 Samuel chapter 19. Peter was a chief apostle. So that leadership over ministers, ministry leadership is mentioned in 1 Timothy chapter 3. The criteria, the eligibilities, everything is mentioned there. So we need spiritual leaders in all levels, in all departments, in all fields. Let God raise leaders. Amen.